Hello, Colin. You're a Mancunian and you've spent most of your time, BBC time, in the north and in news, I think. But you started as a newspaper journalist, is that right?
Yes, David. I was born in Manchester. After A levels, I did a year's pre-entry course in newspaper journalism at Sheffield, and then came back to the Northwest, where I started working on an apprenticeship with the Stockport Express, which was part of the Thomson organisation. Quite good training. I did 4 years there and got my qualifications with the National Council for the Training of Journalists, and then went on to work for an evening paper in Oldham, the Oldham Evening Chronicle. Quite a grounding in papers in the Northwest.
And this was general journalism, was it?
Absolutely, yes. We most reporters start off in this way. So I was a general reporter at this stage. Later on, I came to specialise in the things that really interested me, which are the arts and media, and eventually I became an environment correspondent. But at that time, you were jacks of all trades, so you did a little bit of everything. Got to see all sorts of things. My weakest part is sport. I'm interested in some sports like horse racing, but not that interested in football. But in general reporting, you have to be a jack of all trades. So I got to cover and see all kinds of things.
Now, in those days, local newspapers were pretty powerful. They are less so now, but presumably they were on a par with the with local radio and so on. So, what made you think of joining the BBC from what was presumably a fairly powerful position locally?
I'd had 7 years in newspapers, and I was thinking at that point I might go into work for a bigger newspaper, or maybe even think about going to work for one of the nationals. But by then I was thinking that I might just want to try something different. And it's quite odd this, because while I was at the Stockport Express, there was something in Stockport called the Talking Newspaper for the Blind, which I think is still going in many areas. And they used mainly local newspaper copy to put together a cassette recording for people with visual impairments. And it was sent out in the post every week. And one week in the office, they were looking for somebody to edit this. The editor came to me and said, "Do you fancy having a go at it?" And I did, and I loved doing it. We'd sub down pieces from the paper that were read out by volunteers, and it was a kind of sort of introduction to radio. I quite enjoyed doing it. I did it for about a year altogether, and then when I'd worked on the evening paper and was thinking about where to go next with it, I kind of enjoyed that feeling of the different side of news. I should say at this stage, I've always been fascinated by show business, music. I play the piano. I've always loved the theatre. So the show busy side of broadcasting was always a little bit dormant. Although, to be honest, I'd never thought about going into broadcasting. But after 7 years and feeling more confident as a reporter, I started doing shifts in local radio. First of all, at commercial radio, which was a big station called Piccadilly Radio in Manchester. So I'd finish my day job at the Oldham Evening Chronicle, drive into Manchester, and then do another shift, news reading on Piccadilly Radio up until about midnight. So it's quite a long day, but you were kind of thrown in at the deep end. I knew lots about news gathering and about journalism then, but not very much about broadcasting.
So, you'd had a voice test, but for an independent radio station. So, you knew you had a good, as it were, good radio presence.
Well, voice test is a bit of a grand way of describing it, because I did some shifts for them. So I started off reporting, and then, of course, nobody wanted to read the news in the evenings. They all wanted to go home, all the staff members. So a lot of the evening bulletins were done by freelancers, and I was fairly chucked into it, really. I got some tips from one of the regular newsreaders, had a few practice runs, and you also had to drive the desk as well, which was quite new to me. Obviously, all the inserts were on cartridges, and you'd have to drive the carts and your own microphone. Sometimes have people on a phone line coming in. All quite new, but exciting. I really enjoyed it.
Tell me about the change to the BBC then, from working for an independent.
Potentially, I could have applied for a job at Piccadilly, which was obviously a commercial station, very commercial. They had some news programmes, but nothing like the range that was on offer at the rival station, which was Radio Manchester down the road. I was actually approached the first and only time in my career that I've been headhunted, if you like. The news editor at Radio Manchester called me and said, "Do you fancy going for a drink?" He lived in Oldham, so he knew what sort of work I'd have been doing on the paper. And I agreed to start freelancing for Radio Manchester, which I did for about, so between the two stations, I did probably about 18 months while I was still working at the paper, freelancing. And then a job came up at Radio Manchester. This was in 1982. I applied for it as a reporter and got it, and then started full-time at the BBC.
This was a staff job, fully pensioned, etc., was it?
It was, and I was unbelievably pleased to get it because, by the time I'd started in this 18-month period, I'd decided then I wanted to work in broadcasting. I really enjoyed it. For me, the BBC was the country's best broadcaster, in my opinion, still is. So to actually get a staff job at the BBC was incredible.
Now, tell me about being trained as a radio journalist, because I think you went to the Langham, as many people did, and did quite a long course there.
I did. I'm trying to remember exactly how long. I have a feeling it was 7 weeks altogether. And local radio had a training unit based at the Langham. A lot of it was the technical side of broadcasting, because I was a senior reporter from newspaper by then, so I knew quite a lot about journalism, but not very much about operating equipment. And the thing in local radio is that you had to do it all. So if you were reading the news, you had to operate the desk. In commercial radio at Piccadilly, they had a little cut-down desk where you had about 3 or 4 faders. But reading the news at Radio Manchester, you had to drive the full desk. It was called a Mark III desk, built by the BBC, but had about 20 faders on it, gramophone decks, and big tape decks and things. So we learnt how to operate that, how to do outside broadcasts, how to edit pieces together. It was thoroughly fascinating. But the big thing for me was the introduction to the wider BBC. We covered all sorts of other things as well about doing program. It wasn't just reading bulletins and putting news reports together. It was about producing programs and driving programs, organising outside broadcasts. And the thing about local radio, as I said, you had to do it all. So there was quite a lot of technical requirements there, because very often in an evening at Radio Manchester, you'd be the only person on the station connecting. We sometimes do bulletins for other BBC stations, and you had to physically put them on air yourself. So there was quite a lot to it, a lot to learn. So I'm pretty sure it was about 7 weeks.
But you wanted to work for local radio rather than for national.
It wasn't a conscious decision, because I'd worked in local journalism. And it's a very good question, because thinking back at my time there, I just assumed that was the correct way to get in at the beginning, if you the foothills of the BBC, if you like. Although I was working at Oxford Road, which was a network centre for the BBC. So other things went on in the building which excited me. Radio 4 did some programmes from there. You and Yours came from there. Some editions of Woman's Hour came from there. There were some network television output from there. BBC Philharmonic was based at Oxford Road. So there were lots of things going on there. I'm not quite sure why I decided to stay with local radio. I just enjoyed it, for one. I had quite a lot of autonomy. I became, after being a reporter, I went on to become a producer, producing the breakfast show, which I did for quite a while. I don't know why I didn't really have network ambitions at that stage.
Now, was local radio changing at that time? Was it becoming more ambitious? Was it becoming more magazine-y? Was it involved with the audience more than it had been when you started?
It was definitely changing. When I first started, I worked when I was producing the breakfast show. Our presenter was a broadcaster called Peter Wheeler, who was quite well known in the area for doing some network radio as well. And he was quite. I learned an awful lot from him, but he was quite old school in terms of radio. So he'd want to rehearse, and we'd time things back to hit the pips at the hour and things like that. But local radio generally was becoming much looser than network radio, more like 5 Live is now, I would say.
Yes.
So we were all speech, which was quite an effort to fill, a couple of hours of all speech. In fact, 2.5 hours in the morning of all speech. But we were becoming looser, putting people on the phone and sending reporters out doing lives. Very similar to 5 Live, the kind of formula for 5 Live. In fact, when 5 Live started up, a lot of people were ex-local radio. And things went wrong all the time. Things were forever, failing you. And if you could survive local radio, I think it put you in a good position to cope with lots of live broadcasting.
How wide was your transmission area, for example, there?
Well, we covered the whole of Greater Manchester, so we got Manchester itself, and then 10 towns around Manchester to make up Greater Manchester. Each town being significant in its own size. Each town having about a population of about 250,000, which was one of Radio Manchester's problems, like the other big stations like Radio London and Radio Birmingham, which became WM. They were broadcasting to massive areas, getting quite sizable audiences, but finding it difficult to create that local identity. And while I was at Radio Manchester, they had some experimental stations in the towns around Manchester. And I worked on one at Wigan, Radio Wigan, which we did for about 3 months, which got huge audiences while we were there because it was ultra local in terms of the coverage that it provided. And it's a kind of idea that the BBC is coming back to now in having, more localised reporting, getting into the communities more. There was the local television experiment where the previous government gave these licenses for local TV to be made, and you've got micro radio stations. I think one of the problems is and I might say he would say this anyway, wouldn't he, having worked professionally in the business, but a lot of these are done by enthusiastic amateurs, so they're hit and miss in how good they are, and they tend not to thrive very well. Ironically, in commercial radio, changes are made that have become apparent in the last few years where they don't have to produce the same amount of news that they would have done at one time. So you've got stations, pretending to be local radio stations, but effectively taking, syndicated content and having a few local stories around. So they're not really local radio. But back to our original conversation about Radio Manchester, when it had these experimental stations, Radio Wigan, which was only on air for 3 months, super serving a local audience with about a staff of about 6 people, was getting huge reach. I think it ended up with a 33% reach into the audience, which was huge. To give you an idea, Radio Manchester's reach at the time was 15%. So within 3 months, this hyper-local station was getting 33% after only being on air for 3 months.
Interesting.
So there's definitely an appetite for it. So to answer your question about the relationship with the audience, it was very, very close because a lot of people felt the BBC was unapproachable. It was too posh, if you like. People, felt quite removed from contacting Radio 4 or Radio 2 or something, but they could walk through the door of their local radio station and talk to a reporter. They'd see them out and about, and it was a much closer relationship with the audience that Network had at the time.
So you were actually encouraging people to come in through the door, were you?
Yeah, we didn't always want them to come in, but they did. Because I later worked at Radio Sheffield, and they literally did come in through the door a lot. But we do lots and lots of outside broadcasts on various programs. So programs will be taken out routinely to do an outside broadcast. And of course, members of the public would just come up to you and talk to the presenters in particular. But they felt as though they were engaged with the audience, and there'd be phone-ins. So it was very accessible for people to get in touch with us.
What was the mechanics of doing an outside broadcast for radio at that time?
We had a radio car. So you could transmit from that. We had a box of tricks called a Wood and Douglas, which was like a sort of rucksack size transmitter. And within Manchester, you could go within a couple of miles away, so covering most of the city centre and broadcast from that. But the main outlet was the radio car, or ISDN was becoming quite fashionable then. So lots of places, like especially town halls, would have an ISDN line, so we could plug into that and broadcast.
Yeah, it's better explain. ISDN is a post office connection.
Very similar to broadband now.
Right, so, but most of the time, if you were interviewing people, you would put them in the radio car.
We would, or we'd actually. You could have a radio mic and portable talkback connection and roam around, which we did an awful lot. So you'd be broadcasting from the car, but you could move around from the car within reason, and get a decent signal back.
What was the relationship with the local newspapers at that stage? I mean, were you rivals? Were you considered as rivals?
Yes and no. A lot. In fact, when I went to Radio Manchester, a lot of the staff were ex-local newspapers, because when they were setting up local radio, there was nowhere else to go looking for local journalists, so they went to
Yeah.
newspapers. And I would say at that stage, some were local newspaper reporters kind of coping with radio rather than fully formed broadcasters. But I think the relationship in the main was quite good. They were seen as complementary. I don't think because our big rival in Manchester was the Manchester Evening News, which was part of the Guardian, so a big, strong evening paper. I don't think we ever thought we were in competition with them. So we certainly weren't taking any advertising from them. So I think it was quite a good relationship.
Presumably, every now and again, or perhaps quite frequently, you would do something for national radio. Would you? You'd be reporting about a local story that had a national interest.
We would. This is quite interesting because we had a network studio within Radio Manchester, and Manchester obviously being a newsy, busy place, we were forever getting guests coming in for the Today programme or World at One or all sorts of people coming in for various network programmes. I have to say, and this is not out of any bitterness, but there was quite a sniffy relationship between local radio and network radio. Sometimes we'd get asked to do voice pieces for the network. This is back in the early 80s. I remember them being quite reticent to use somebody from local radio. In fact, sometimes they didn't even trust us to get things right. They'd wait for it to, this is the London newsroom, would wait for things to appear on the Press Association before they believe it, because they wouldn't. If somebody from Radio Manchester told them it had happened, they didn't quite believe it. They'd wait for it to come on PA. And having worked in newspapers, where a lot of PA originates from, as a local newspaper reporter, we'd regularly file things for PA. It was quite ironic, really, that our own organisation at the BBC didn't quite trust the people in local radio. They'd wait for it to appear on PA, but it got better over the years.
It did, and it's good now, is it?
It's very good now, and you're seeing, especially because of staffing cuts, you're seeing regional local reporters appearing on network all the time. So what used to happen is that network which would have their own reporters based in Manchester, so we knew them well, but they'd always want their own voice or their own face on reports, and I think that's changing now. Of course, a lot of people in network are ex-local radio or ex-regional television.
Yes, I think that's very interesting that because of the cuts, in a sense, the local radio people have now got more influence.
Yeah, that's certainly happened. I think there's also a loosening up of, there was a bit of snobbery about local radio at the time, definitely. I remember as part of my training, going back to my training in London, and I'm from Manchester. I've got a northern accent, which is not a pronounced Mancunian accent, but I remember having some training with a well-known presenter from Radio 2 in London who suggested, I might like to say, Bath rather than Bath, or grass rather than grass. And I resisted this, and of course it would be unheard of now, but this was only in 1982. So there was a feeling then that local radio accents, which of course we wanted local accents, especially with the presenters, you'd want, Radio Manchester would want somebody who sounded like they came from Manchester, or Radio Sheffield, where I worked later on, they'd want somebody who sounded as if they were from the area. But there was a bit of snobbery around over that, which is long gone. That's not around anymore at all.
Well, that's interesting. Now, you did an awful lot of broadcasting at night time or in the early morning, didn't you?
I did. We used to have a shift because after being a reporter, I became a producer. Who tended to go out less, but these were all speech programs. So you were based in the studio, and I did a couple of shifts on the breakfast show. Quite took to it. The station manager must have thought I was quite good at it, and I became the permanent producer on Radio Manchester's breakfast show, which was great because I enjoyed the adrenaline buzz of 2.5 hours of live broadcasting every morning, working. I learned an awful lot about broadcasting in that time with a very seasoned presenter who, to tell you a little aside, he'd done quite a lot of network radio himself. And he lived in Cheshire, which was about a half-hour drive away. And at that time, he had a car phone, which was really, really unusual for somebody to have a phone in the car. I'd get a call maybe about 20 past 6, bearing in mind we were on air at 6:30, saying that, and this was, you couldn't connect directly. It was an operator would connect you, saying, Mr. Wheeler is on his way. And he'd always lie about how close he was to the station. He'd always say, I'll be with you, Colin, in 10 minutes. And then 15, 20 minutes later, he'd arrive. Our first part of the programme was music, so we could actually play some music till he rolled up. But you had to fly by the seat of your pants. So the other aspect of it, was, of course, was having to get up ridiculously early, which like 3:30 in the morning to get to the station, 4:30 to 5 o'clock, 5 o'clock at the latest. So for about 10 years at Radio Manchester and then Radio Sheffield, I was getting up at 3:30 every morning. For anybody who's ever done that, it really plays havoc with your sort of sleep pattern. And even now, years and years later, I'm such a light sleeper. If the phone goes in the middle of the night, I hear it on the second ring, or it doesn't take anything at all to wake me up, because getting up at that time in the morning, it's fatal. As anybody who works at those crazy hours will tell you, fatal to press snooze on your alarm and say, I'll just have 10 minutes. You hear the alarm and you have to get out of bed. Otherwise, if you go back to sleep, you'll never get out again. And which I think is why, if you talk to people who do early broadcasting on television or radio, certainly in network, a lot of them will send cars for presenters on network television. And I think one of the main reasons is to just make sure they get there.
Yes, I've often wondered about the effect on sleep of people. You think of the people who do the Today programme, in a sense that was running on in parallel with you, wasn't it? Almost a sort of rival.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sleep-wise, I'd finish about 1 o'clock, go home, and for me, best way I didn't like going to bed early because I didn't like going out in the evening, or maybe going to theatre or going out for a meal or something like that. I never liked the pattern of going to bed at 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the evening. So I'd have a couple of hours sleep when I got back in the afternoon, and then stay up till 10, 10:30 at night. So that's how it works for me. But it does messes your body clock up.
Yes, I was going to say your sleep pattern is you're sleeping 2 periods during the day rather than having a long sleep at night.
And people do it in different ways. Some people will go to bed early because they're getting up. It's quite fascinating how people cope with it. But I enjoyed it, actually. I like, because Manchester's a big, busy city. So if you were driving in for 9 o'clock in the morning, you'd find yourself snarled up in the rush hour for probably another hour trying to drive in. Whereas 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, you can just sail in with the milk floats, and it is quite nice. By the time everybody else is rolling in at 9 o'clock, your day's almost half over, and you're quite fresh and alert by that stage.
Yeah.
And you either like it or you don't. I have to say, hand on heart, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed those early mornings.
Any particular scoops that you got?
I think the biggest one while I was there was the Moors murders, which were obviously a big story in Manchester, Greater Manchester. And then while I was there, they found one of the bodies that Hindley and Brady had never talked about. And then the Greater Manchester Police went back onto the moors at Saddleworth to find a body. So that was a huge story while I was there. There were riots in Manchester, as there had been in London later on in the 2000s. But it was a busy, newsy sort of patch, all sorts going on, certainly in my time in radio.
But also, you presumably had to deal with music. What music to play, or?
I did. Initially, I used to choose the music for the breakfast show. We didn't play a lot of music. We played about 4 discs an hour. And you have to choose your discs quite carefully with that small selection, because they were preceding speech, and I think I was reasonable at it. I didn't just play things that I liked personally. The difficulty with the local radio audience is that most people who work for local radio are in their early 20s. The audience for it is 50 plus.
Yes.
So you couldn't choose music that you liked. You had to try and choose music that fitted in with your audience. And in my time there, because I went on to become program organizer in charge of the music, And they developed, I think one of the BBC engineers from Radio Leicester had developed a computer program to choose music for local radio, which was, I have to say, pretty dire. They would categorize music, for instance, their opening potential, a bit like at a disco or a party where the DJ will play a song, a record at a wedding, which gets people up to dance. And in local radio terms, these were called openers, and they would get people moving. Be a good opening record, and they classified music like in that way, and the computer program would pick them from this selection. And it all, in the end, it sounds great, but in the end, it all became very samey. Same records tended to come around a lot. And then commercial radio went on to develop similar programs with their gold station or the 60 stations. There's nothing to compare that, I think, with a talented human being choosing music that you hear on Radio 2. Somebody who really knows his or her music, a producer choosing music and surprising you, really. What these programs do, they don't surprise you in the way that a human being can.
Tell me a bit about the relationship with the police up there, because they have a checkered history, don't they, the police in that part of the world?
They do. Certainly at local, when I was working in newspapers, you'd have to go to, one of the things that reporters would be assigned to do would be to call round at the divisional police headquarters, and you'd talk to whoever was in charge of CID that day and find out what was going on. So it was a much closer relationship. In broadcast, when I went to Radio Manchester, we didn't have the staff to go to every divisional headquarters of Greater Manchester Police. So we'd get things over the phone. And I think gradually over the years, the relationship, not just in the Northwest, but generally has become more fraught as the police started employing press officers and they became more careful about what they released. The police became more careful about talking to journalists. I teach journalism now at the University of Sheffield, and our students find it very difficult to actually find somebody from the police to talk to because they become much more estranged from the media for good and bad reasons, I think, but they become much more cautious about talking to the media.
But presumably in the early days when you were a newspaper reporter, you depended an awful lot on the police.
You did, and they would, because you'd see somebody, quite a senior officer every day, you got to know them to an extent. To be honest, I was never really interested in being a crime reporter, but colleagues who specialised in that developed quite close relationships with the police, and they'd be given a steer on what was behind a story and trusted in a way. I think that's the essence of it. If there's trust on both sides, then that's where big scoops can come from.
Now, Colin, did you work in television?
I did work in television, because I spent 30 years at the BBC, 15 of those in radio and 15 in television, exact half and half split. Quite lucky at working at Manchester because the regional television programme North West Tonight was and is based in the same building. So we had quite a lot to do with our television colleagues. It started for me because I ended up as news editor at Radio Manchester. And one of the great things about the BBC was the attachment system where you can swap with somebody else's job. So I was quite senior in terms of local radio as a news editor, but I was able to swap with one of the television producers, and we were both on the same band. We were on band 9 at the time. So we were able to do a direct swap. He knew virtually nothing about local radio. I knew very little about television. So I had to start off, although my attachment was to end up as a producer, which is what he was, I had to kind of learn the ropes before I was able to do that. But the last, say, month or so of my attachment, I was producing North West Tonight, which was terrific and a real change for me. More, I mentioned before that I like theatre, I like show business. Television was far more show busy than radio for me. And I really took to it. It's more complex, it's more involved. But I just really enjoyed it, the production side of it, and then later on on screen as a correspondent.
But you didn't get training in the way that you got trained for radio journalism. You didn't get trained.
No, it's quite interesting. In fact, because a lot of the kind of ladder into television, a lot of people start in local radio, and I think they assume that you know quite a lot about journalism and broadcasting, which obviously you do by that stage. The kind of age group tends to be a bit older, So my training was very much on the job at Northwest Tonight. I was very lucky to have some incredible colleagues. But when I started reporting, a lot of my training was from the camera crews that I worked with. Very, very good cameramen. A couple of women at the time, not very many, but more so these days. But I learned an awful lot about presentation from cameramen and then from editors who you'd work with then. So a lot of training was from experienced colleagues. But then there were lots of training courses as well. So I went on a whole range of different training courses on production. And later on, there was a huge training course in regional television, which controversially went over to this video journalism where reporters would shoot their own material and edit it themselves after a 3-week course in Newcastle. So I went on that. That was quite a bruising experience, but ended up filming and editing lots of my own pieces.
Why was it bruising?
Just because, first of all, there was a guy who ran it, was an American called Michael Rosenblum, and he had all sorts of theories about TV news. One was being that you should never direct any action. You should wait for things to happen in front of you before you film them. And this was alien to me, having worked in TV for quite some time then. You think, well, if I wait for somebody to walk across that road and come in through that door, instead of asking them to do that, I could be there all day. So we were used to directing the action. He was well against that, and they just threw you into it, literally threw you into it. So on the first day you were given your own camera kit, decent Sony camera with a tripod and good microphones and headphones, the same headphones I'm wearing today incidentally, and then sent out to get stories and put them together. And you can imagine the early results were pretty dire. He himself wasn't a great technician, so he had some really good BBC colleagues there, some cameramen and sound, and editors who worked with us to help us in doing all that. So there's this huge learning curve. And at the time, bizarrely, we were working out of BBC Newcastle, because they had hardly any space in their car park. Even by this stage, we were in our sort of 30s, a lot of people that were there in their 30s, and they had this rule that you had to go around on public transport rather than go in a car to cover stories. So you can imagine what that was like.
Interesting. So you were presenting, but also you were directing news coverage, were you?
Well, in between then, I did a management job called Biomedia Editor, where I was responsible for stories going across the Northwest 3 radio stations and Northwest Tonight. So that was a mainly management job. And then I got a full-time job as Environment Correspondent on Northwest Tonight. The big change for me was suddenly being on screen, which I'd never been on before, and found I quite enjoyed it, actually. It's a little bit of acting involved. I'd done some acting before in amateur companies, so enjoyed that side of it quite a lot. And I just enjoyed the mechanics of television. My boss was quite gracious in saying he thought I was natural at it initially. Then I got more used to it, like you do with anything. So did a lot of, I'd be doing about 3 or 4 pieces a week. And because I'd done some production of the programme during my attachment, I also got called on to produce the programme quite a lot. So I'd be producing the programme, say, once a week. And this went on for a long time. So most of my time was reporting, but a lot of production in that time. In my time in TV, there were enormous changes in the technology while I was there.
ENPS presumably came in while you were...
It did. In fact, I led the team that brought ENPS into Manchester. There were a number of big changes for reporters. One, when I first started, we were on typewriters, obviously. And then we had BASIS, which was quite a crude computer program, but it did its job. And then ENPS, which was a bit more sophisticated, an American product where you could do more things in the production of your program. And then the big change was being able to attach all your, this was still with ENPS while I was there, attach all your video and your captions, your auto cue to the same file in a running order. And then that meant for a producer, you could easily move things around in a program very, very quickly. And I think it changed live television for the BBC enormously because you had so much more flexibility in doing things. And then it kind of developed to the position where you could attach camera moves to your running order in EMPS. And if you look now at the 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock news on BBC One, where you've got these robotic cameras moving around in front of the presenter, all of those moves are computer controlled by commands inputted sometimes by the journalist, not those kind of technical commands, but a lot of the commands for your piece would be put in by you, the reporter. So it's got more technical, certainly.
What's your view of news? I was thinking of national news now. It seems very dated. I mean, we've got very formulaic. We've got the old Lambinian graphics sequences, the tabloid red and white and the spinning globes and all that sort of thing. But I mean, that must be now 20 years old.
You mean in the look of how it
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
looks?
The actual
It's
news
been
branding.
sure, yeah. I mean, it's been around for a while, although it is hugely recognisable in a time of great change within the industry. I thought you were going to say about the actual, built program elements of how news is presented, because as I say, I teach young people to work in television now, and a lot of my students never watch built programs on TV. We have to tell them you ought to go and watch the 1 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock news or ITV or Channel 4, because they don't get their news in the same way that we do and did. So I don't know how it's going to change in the end. The cosmetic side of it, I take your point. It seems time for a refresh, but I know from my time at Northwest Tonight that changes were hugely expensive. So I would imagine.
I think that's the problem, that it's been a very expensive business, and whereas they had several branding changes in the 80s, the 90s, the noughties. I think the current system has been there rather a long time. It would be very expensive to change it.
I would imagine that that's one of the big reasons behind not changing it, because there have been huge cutbacks in BBC News in terms of personnel. So I think it would be hard to justify spending millions on a relook at the moment.
Yes. But there is another thing, of course, which is that you've now got rolling television news, and that's very different from having a news programme, which is a built programme at a particular time, 10 o'clock or whatever. Rolling news is very different.
It certainly is. One of my colleagues at Northwest Tonight regularly did shifts on News 24, it was called at the time, the news channel. And said how difficult it was to be. He was doing, these were presentorships at the news channel, and how you had to be just across a huge range of stories. Like you'd be sat there presenting, and in your ear would become right. We're going over to Gaza now to do a live on that, and you'd have to be up to speed with what was going on. And then next, we're doing the Cameron inquiry, and then you have to switch to that. A little bit like local radio on a bigger scale. Local radio was loose and fast moving and at its best, very flexible and nimble. And I think it takes a certain sort of person to thrive on that kind of attention span. Of course, we've got now it's talking in 2021, we've got yet another channel about to start, GB News. I think the jury's out on the appetite for rolling news. Obviously, somebody like me who's worked in journalism all his life, is interested in that kind of thing. But whether people generally are, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I've not worked on those kind of network programs, but working on Northwest Tonight, I mean, at the heyday the height of the time when I was there, we had 2 million viewers one night, which was incredible. Now, by in today's standards, when you're talking about a network drama program aiming for about 4.5 million, and we'd had 2 million just in the Northwest. But the program certainly had its own identity. Its presenters were very, very well known, and the reporters were well known as well. I mean, we talked about my switch to TV. One of the big changes for me was getting recognised, and people coming up to me in the street and saying hello, and not just where I live, but all over the Northwest, and getting used to the fact that all of a sudden, you're a familiar face for many people. That took a while to get used to.
That's very interesting. I remember before I joined the BBC, I was living in Lancashire, and I used to go down to what was looked north in those days with Stuart Hall in a third floor studio at Piccadilly, I think it was, in Manchester, going out from really quite a small space there. Do you remember that?
I do. I never worked at Piccadilly, but I remember BBC being at Piccadilly. And of course, when I joined the BBC, a lot of staff who went on to work on North West Tonight had worked at Piccadilly, and I never went in it, but I can imagine what it was like in there. Probably quite old-fashioned. And talking to some of the people who'd worked on it, of course, it took a long time to produce TV in those days
Yes.
because it was. They were working on film and it took lots of time to do things. And I remember when I first started, because I started in TV in 1998, and a lot of the camera crews were used to having a decent lunch break. They'd say, where are we going for lunch? And I said, well, we're not, we've got to carry on because we need to get this back. So it was a kind of different era where they had fewer items in the programme than when I
Yes.
finished in half an hour. We might have 20 odd items in the programme. So changed enormously. But going back to this kind of Stuart Hall days, he was a controversial figure now, but at the time hugely popular presenter in the Northwest. Very very well known, and lots of presenters like him. We had on Northwest Tonight when I was on the programme. We had Gordon Burns, who'd presented the Krypton Factor and some national television as well. Surprise, surprise with Cilla Black. Very very well known, popular figure, and these programmes have had and have huge identities of their own, which is a long-winded way of answering your question about
Yeah.
rolling news. Where programs develop their own identity, which is not always about people, but the kind of things that they cover. And you're right, Channel 4 has a different Channel 4 News has a different feel to it than a typical rolling news program.
Tell me about editorial policy. We had, probably after producer choice, with the producer guidelines, a huge tome of procedures and how you should deal with different situations and so on. I mean, were you very much aware of that?
Oh, absolutely, because I'd spent quite a bit of my time as a news editor, so I was forever having to grapple with producer guidelines and things that we could do and things we couldn't do. In local radio, we got the feeling that you could get away with quite a lot because nobody quite senior in the BBC was listening to you, so we would be a bit more autonomous in things. It got more tricky when I moved into television. My own experience of sort of editorial policy was that sometimes they were great. I found the lawyers really good and very very quick. Would give you decent answers to your problems. They were a kind of can-do approach to whether you could actually broadcast something or not. I found some of the editorial policy people not conducive to broadcasting because they'd want ages to think about a program, come up with solutions which didn't really help you. When you wanted an answer to whether we can actually broadcast something or not, they weren't always that helpful. But we had to use them. On certain stories, we'd have to take a call from them. I think a lot of people who'd been working in journalism for quite some time found a lot of the dilemmas common sense, really. If you'd been working in news for quite a long time, as a good editor or a good program producer could come up with a decent answer. One of the great things about the BBC was that you could always go to somebody else to talk a problem through with. You could always refer up to somebody else to come up with a decent answer. On a wider level, there's a lot of talk about the BBC having a particular slant these days, which I find very irritating as somebody who's worked in news in the northwest for a long time. This kind of image perpetuated during political debates that everybody who works for the BBC is London based, is metropolitan elite, public school educated,
They're all Guardian readers.
Guardian readers, groupthink, all the rest of it. I can say hand on heart, I never saw any evidence of being lent on to take a particular stance on a story. When I was producing the programme, I'd have quite a lot of autonomy and never felt under pressure to take a particular line. And of course, we weren't. Not many of us felt elite or, metropolitan biased in any way.
No. But you always think of the expression unconscious bias and the feeling
There,
that
yeah,
there is a
I mean, I would,
tendency to be liberal, left wing, if you like.
yeah, I think I would agree that not as a direct imposition from the BBC, but there was, yeah, it tended to attract more liberal-minded people. But I think journalism does anyway. I've got lots of friends working in journalism, not just in the BBC, but journalists tend to be more open-minded, more tending towards being more liberal in many areas. And I know people who worked in national newspapers who found, their copy has been changed by the management to follow a particular slant, but left to their own devices, they wouldn't write in that kind of way. Interesting debate.
Yes, it is. So you left the BBC in the end, but to become an academic.
I'd put a question mark by academic because I don't feel like an academic. But yeah, I took voluntary redundancy in 2013, not because I was fed up with the BBC. Far from it. I loved the BBC. I still love it. I can say, I mean, we all have good days and bad days, but most days I would enjoy going into work. So it was quite a wrench to leave it and leave a lot of very good colleagues. And the thing I found mainly about working at the BBC was that there's first of all there's a camaraderie, but there's also a collective spirit of we're in a particular problem together. So the teams were very, very cohesive in the way that they operated, and if you were working under quite difficult conditions sometimes with a cameraman or a soundman, you know that they would do anything to help you out, and vice versa. So there was that spirit of working together. I always really enjoyed that about the BBC, and something I don't see in academia. That's not to say I don't work with some great colleagues, because I do, but it's just quite different in that sense. But I was, like many people, came to my late 50s, was finding it a bit harder, all the chasing around, driving 40,000 miles a year
Yes.
was beginning to take its toll. So I now work 2.5 days a week at the University of Sheffield, teaching journalism, trying to keep up with the pace of change in the industry, which is moving so rapidly. But equally finding that good journalism is good journalism, good programs are still good programs, and the essence of what I'm teaching is the kind of stuff I learned when I was in my 20s. The technology has changed, but
Yeah.
a lot of the the things about it, writing and good storytelling, have always been there.
But what about citizen journalism, if you like, and the whole of the freedom that the current technology has given people to produce their own stuff?
Yeah, it's had a huge change on the way that newsrooms operate, because at any event, there'll always be somebody there with a camera. Now, there'll be a camera being their phone. A lot of phone footage is extremely good these days. In fact, before I left Northwest Light, some reporters were producing pieces on phones with a high-end iPhone or high-end Android phone. So there's that aspect of getting pictures there, which is great for broadcasters. When you get into people becoming citizen journalists, as a trained qualified journalist, I would always raise an eyebrow about that, because they people who put things out on the internet as fact don't always have, well, in fact, don't have the training to balance
Yeah,
a
it's a two-edged
story.
sword, isn't it? I mean, some of it is threatening because of fake news and so on. And of course, you have, the issue of the trusted source of information, which you hope the BBC will continue to be, as opposed to unknown sources or sources which are of unknown validity.
Exactly, and then you've also had, in recent times, the Donald Trump assault on journalists, actually encouraging people to physically attack journalists in in some cases, but also to question what they're saying. And there are good and bad journalists, obviously, like any other profession, but the good ones are trained to be objective and to be impartial and curate news in a way that the citizen journalism doesn't do that. So it's a huge, interesting area, and I don't quite know what the end result of that will will be, but there's going to be more of it, definitely.
Yes, it's going to be an interesting decade, I suspect. Because a lot of these things will shake up to some extent. Got a prediction for the future? BBC future?
I hope the BBC will still be here in 20 years' time. I really, really do hope it will still be here in 20 years' time. I think it's under a lot of threat from kind of commercial activity, really. As we're speaking now in May 2021, there's a story today that Channel 4 might be sold off. And to see a commercialisation of television in particular happening an awful lot, where big American streaming companies are now moving into Britain, and a kind of group think that that's the way, that's the only way that TV in particular can go. And at the moment, there's been, I think actually the tide is turning slightly, because we're talking at the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the streaming companies have done very well with people signing up for services. And I get in fact, there have been quite a few stories around that people are beginning to get tired of this, this diet of being constantly fed things and wanting to be more selective in what they watch. So, and I think the BBC is definitely offering something different to that. I just hope that people realise what it does offer, because there's a kind of swell of opinion, mainly commercially led, I think, people with vested interest to knock the BBC and say, well, why can't everything be done on a pay your money, take your choice kind of basis? And you see, I was looking at television selection today in a couple of newspapers, and you'll see programmes being recommended tonight that are on Netflix or Amazon or Sky Atlantic, and things where you have to pay for them. So who knows what things will be like in 20 years' time, but I sincerely hope the BBC is still here. BBC is certainly tighter. I know from colleagues who still work there, money is incredibly tight in a way that I think it hasn't been so acute before. There have always been financial crises in the BBC, but I think at the moment, it's having to do an awful lot with a diminishing income. And yes, there are political sides to what's happening with the BBC, and the BBC has many unfriendly enemies at the moment. And I think if it can ride those out, I think mainly, ironically being a journalist, but a lot of its problems come from its news division. Different political parties expect the BBC to reflect what they want to reflect, and of course it doesn't. It tries to be impartial, but then they forget the BBC does all sorts of other things as well. So its news agenda, news output causes lots of problems, but then clearly it's very important to maintain that. Speaking to my own students, who knows how people are going to gather their news in the future. My students certainly know what's going on, but they don't read newspapers, they don't watch built television, so most of their kind of news information is coming through their mobile phone. And I think the BBC and other broadcasters are adapting to that, and newspapers are slowly adapting to that. But from my time in newspapers, the advertising revenue was enormous for a local newspaper, whereas a lot of that has now gone to the internet companies, to Google, Facebook, etc. They've sucked all that money out. That money was supporting local journalism.
Yeah. But your students are an interesting group, aren't they? Because their attitudes towards the BBC are quite important if they're going to go into broadcasting in some way. I mean, do they automatically think, the BBC, that's where I want to work? Or do they not just not consider it?
Sorry if I gave that impression. No, they really rate the BBC. So anyone who wants to go into broadcasting, they want to work for the BBC. The BBC is seen by them as the place to go to be a broadcaster, which is great. Having spent a lifetime working for it, that it still has that kudos and appeal. And they do. The fact that I've worked for the BBC for 30 years is a big bonus for lots of my students, because they value my experience in it, and they still rate the BBC extremely highly. So that's where we are now, and hopefully that will remain.
That's a very positive point on which to end, probably, Colin. Thanks very much for doing this.
You're welcome. My pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking to you, David.